Hi, I'm Tash. Welcome to Tash's Library. Today's video is going to be a very, very late wrap up for what I read in October. I almost toyed with not doing this video because it's so late, but I decided that I did actually want to talk about my feelings about the books that I read. Firstly, I did fail in my October TBR to some extent. I read more books than I'd planned to read, but I didn't read two of the books that were on my TBR. So the first one is Before the Coffee Gets Cold, Tales from the Cafe. This was supposed to fulfill the prompt, great first line. I kind of wanted to read this, but for some reason, I just wasn't in the mood. I was in the mood for more epic fantasies and some other books. And it was weird. I'm not usually a mood reader. I can usually put something on my TBR and get to it. But for some reason, October was a weird month and I didn't get to this, even though I really do want to read this book because I loved the first book. Second book I didn't read was In the Lives of Puppets by T.J. Klune. This was for the prompt, the color wheel that I had to pick, and I picked green, and so this was the book I picked. Now, I did start this, as you can see. I didn't read very much, and I was loving it. I really like the characters. I really love the ideas in it so far. I was intrigued about what was going to happen next, but I was not in the mood for it, and I ended up picking a more epic fantasy instead. I do plan to read this. I really do want to read this. It just didn't happen this month. The first book I'm going to talk about is Starsight by Brandon Sanderson. This is the second book in the Skyward series, and it is a young adult science fiction series. I gave this 5 stars. This was so awesome. So this was for the prompt pick a wheel. So I didn't actually be given a choice for this one, but I'm so happy it got picked because it was such a wonderful read. Now, I can't tell you what Starsight's about because that would be a spoiler, but the first book, Skyward, follows Spencer, whose dream is to become a fighter pilot, following in the footsteps of her father. However, there are challenges in her reaching flight school because her father was considered a coward who pulled out of a deadly battle. She does make it to flight school very early on in the novel, and it's really just following her challenges in showing people that she is not her father. Now, Starsight takes a little bit of a different setting, and it really looks at some themes of prejudice and identity and class. What I loved about this book was the setting. Once again, Sanderson is fabulous at world building, and one of the settings in particular is incredible. I also really enjoyed the development of Spencer's character because she was a little bit annoying in the first novel, and you're definitely seeing growth in her character. There are also some fabulous supporting characters, including Mbot, who I love. And this book has quite a lot of political intrigue, which I really enjoyed. I don't always enjoy political elements to a novel, but in this case, it was done really well. I would highly recommend this to any lovers of YA science fiction and anyone looking for a fun to read science fiction book with political elements. I loved Starsight so much that I then went on to Skyward Flight, which is a combination of 3 different novellas that you read at different points in the Skyward series. The first one is the one I read, which is Sunreach, and this you read straight after Starsight. Once again, it's following the same setting and characters, but this one actually looks at characters outside of Spencer. And I loved it because it was so fun to follow some of the other really loved supporting characters in the series. It's got doom slugs, which are the most awesome companion animals ever. And it has some great tense action scenes. I ended up giving this 4 stars. The reason I kind of brought it down a little bit from Starsight is because it was fairly predictable. It has a very YA voice in comparison to even the other 2 novels in the series so far. there's nothing groundbreaking, but it was such a fun read that I highly recommend you do read these if you're looking at reading the Skyward series. And I'd recommend this to anyone who's just looking for light YA science fiction. For the prompt, no the, a, an, off, or and in the title, I ended up picking Bang Bang Bodhisattva by Aubrey Wood, which is a 2023 release. This book is a combination of a cyberpunk and a noir thriller. It is really cool. It follows a transgender hacker named Kira and a private detective named Angel, who are sort of brought together for financial reasons often, and they having to do jobs together, even though they don't really get on initially. They are from different generations with different life experiences, and they are the most unlikely of buddies, basically. They are brought together to investigate a murder and a missing person. And it's just really cool how it develops. This novel does explore themes like identity and exploitation, and I really enjoyed the unpredictability of the plots. I loved the generation clash between the two characters and some of the difficult, challenging moments they experience. I loved the pop culture references in this, and it was quite funny. I genuinely did laugh at times, and I ended up giving it a 4-star for that reason. The reason I brought it down a little bit is because the mystery itself, like the murder mystery, missing persons mystery, was not as engaging as I'd hoped. I also didn't feel that close to the characters. I felt like the characterization was great in terms of who the characters represented, who they were, but you didn't really come to truly care what happened to them through their dialogue and through their development. Some of the dialogue as well was a little bit unrealistic, and there was a lot of it. And even though I really loved the representation in this novel, I found that sometimes it became a little bit preachy about it. Other than that, I really recommend this to any lovers of cyberpunk, particularly with detective noir elements combined. Anyone kind of looking at those sci-fi mystery combos, and anyone looking for representation in science fiction. For the prompt, match my outfits, I ended up picking Howling Dark by Christopher Ruocchio. This is the second book in the Sun Eater series, and I loved the first book, and I was so excited to read this. This is a science fiction space opera that follows Hadrian Marlowe, who is considered by some to be a hero and by others as a supervillain who killed billions. And Empire of Silence begins by looking at some of his backstory in his young years and how he does some traveling initially, and we're starting to set up the story. This is a fabulous series. The writing is so incredible. This one has a fabulous plot, outstanding world building, just incredibly done, so original, so unique. One of the planets visited in particular was just one of the most unique settings I've ever encountered in science fiction. Great treatment of the aliens as well, because they very clearly have a different worldview, a different perspective, a different way of even understanding the world due to their language, which is really cool. We don't often think about that. It's not just being able to communicate the words, it's just that the way we use words might change the meaning, and sometimes we don't comprehend certain meanings because we may not have the words in our language that communicate those ideas. And this is done incredibly well in this novel. Very high stakes, wonderful characters. This really takes the tension and the stakes to a whole new level. It explores the ethics of cloning. It explores loyalty and duty. It's just incredible. The plot is so unpredictable. And I gave this a 4 stars. And the only reason for that, because to be honest, the majority of this book was top tier. This was incredible and I highly recommend it. But the beginning was a bit slow. So it took me about 100 pages to really pull me in. And I think part of this is because there is a bit of a time gap between novel 1 and 2. And the first 100 pages is sort of trying to catch you up to where you are in the story. And I'm ashamed to admit that there were points in those first 100 pages that I was tempted to DNF this book because I just wasn't enjoying it and I was so disappointed. And I think particularly because I had such high expectations for it. But I did persevere and I'm so happy I did because this was an incredible book and I cannot wait to continue the series. Really, if you love science fiction, if you love a fantasy even, and want to delve into some light science fiction, if you enjoy intricate world building, this series is a must read. For published in 2023, I read The Malevolent 7 by Sebastien de Castell. This is my first foray into Sebastien de Castell's writing. It is a fantasy novel that follows 2 main characters initially, and then you build up with more characters, and you're following Cade and Corrigan, who are magic wielders, who are taking on a very, very dangerous mission and having to gather the crew in order to do so. This kind of is sort of a fantasy version of The Dirty Dozen. It's fabulous and it explores the consequences of power very, very well. The characters are incredibly fun in this. There is a really cool jackal character, which is awesome character. The settings are pretty epic. There's also very cool a demon character. And I just found this like such a fun read. I gave it 4 stars. And what brought it down for me was in the middle, there were some side quests. There were some side quests as they moving towards the mission and gathering the crew. And there is a particular section in the middle which I didn't feel furthered the plot in any way and was a bit slow and boring and probably a little bit unnecessary with regard to character development. It's also a bit gory, so I have to warn you about that. It is quite dark at times, and there is a lot of blood and a lot of gore. So I would highly recommend this to any lovers of sort of heist type fantasies where you've got crews getting together to pull off quests that are just impossible. And anyone who kind of likes grimdark with an element of humor and lightheartedness as well. Very fun read, highly recommended. For 0 to 9, where I spun a 7, I ended up picking Second Foundation by Isaac Asimov because the page numbers end with 7. And this is the 3rd book in the original Foundation trilogy. Now, obviously, I can't tell you what happens in this book, but Foundation follows a psychohistorian who predicts that the Empire is going to collapse and that humanity is going to enter this thousands and thousands of years of knowledge dark age, basically. And his way of circumventing that is to create an encyclopedia where he accumulates all known knowledge. And he does this by sending a team to this far off planet. That's the basis of it. Then it becomes this great book about insane political wheelings and dealings. And the first book is very plot driven, very ideas driven. The second and third books are far more character driven. So there is definitely more characterization involved in that, largely because they don't cover the same massive sweep of time. This book I gave 5-star to. I love Foundation. I have loved the first 2 books, and this one is no exception. This is fabulous. The plot is so unpredictable, so engaging. The main protagonist in this is a really interesting character and an intriguing character choice too, because one of the things that kind of didn't work sometimes in this novel. And I mean, I say that because after giving it 5 stars, right? But there is a very young character, and you got this sort of juxtaposition of this really young character with some really dark themes. So it's almost like it reads a little bit YA in parts, but then you're very quickly reminded that this is no YA novel. This is an adult novel, and not because it's got any spiciness or anything. It's more that it really does deal with very, very big ideas about humanity. The main character, because she's young as well, does make some silly decisions, but this is completely congruent with her age and life experience. I would totally recommend Foundation and this entire trilogy to any lovers of big idea science fiction and political intrigue. For the urban prompt, I picked Turncoat by Jim Butcher. This is number 11 in the Dresden Files, which I'm gradually working my way through. This is an urban fantasy series following Harry Dresden, who is a wizard for hire in Chicago. It's a great series that includes werewolves and vampires and fairies. Initially starts a sort of monster of the week stories, but the overarching plot does develop and becomes darker and darker as it goes through, and the stakes get higher as the series progresses. This particular book I loved. It was engaging as expected. Dresden Files always delivers. Had some cool twists with some great character developments, some very dark and heartbreaking moments at times, an epic climax, a really cool murder mystery thrown in, and a really interesting new PI character as well. This was exactly what I expected. I gave it 4 stars, and the only reason I didn't give it 5 stars is because it's kind of same old. It's Harry Dresden. Each book is very much similar to other books, even though the story does progress. And I find sometimes they're not overly memorable. However, they are so fun, and I'd recommend this to any lovers of urban fantasy. For the books, libraries, and language prompts, I picked Ink, Blood, Sister, Scribe by Emily Torzs. This follows Joanna and Esther, who are sisters who haven't seen each other for a long time. Joanna is effectively a recluse who's preserving the family's magical books after the death of their father. And then you have Esther, who has pretty much been on the move since she left home in the hope that she can avoid the magic that killed their mother. She is currently in Antarctica and starting to feel quite comfortable with her predicaments until she starts seeing spots of blood on a mirror, and she knows that the magic is coming for her. This book explores the themes of family, sacrifice, betrayal, the power of knowledge, and the question of whether we can actually control magic and whether we should control magic. I loved the magical books in this. They certainly gave this book a dark academia vibe. There's a really cool mystery within it because you're not quite sure what's happening, and you're just gradually investigating along with the characters in a way, and you're slowly learning the truth about what's happening. And there are some unpredictable moments. There are some very dark and tense moments as well. However, I ended up giving this 3 stars, and mainly because it was quite slow. I prefer fast-paced books. So I think if you enjoy slow burns, you would love this. I didn't love it because of it. And the characters are not particularly lovable. I didn't feel invested in the outcomes for them. I didn't love them, but I was intrigued as to what was going to happen. I would recommend this to any lovers of dark academia or contemporary literature because it is beautifully written And I think if you generally enjoy contemporary literature with elements of magical realism, then you'd love this book. One of the books I picked up just for a mood read was The Blacktongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman. I have been meaning to read this for quite some time, and when I put down In the Lives of Puppets, I decided that I wanted to read something like this instead. This is the first in the fantasy series, and it follows Kinch, who is a thief belonging to this guild, and he is desperately trying to pay off the tuition that he owes the guild. And in order to help him do so, the guild give him a really big, well-paying job. However, not everything is as it seems. But this does start off a really epic quest across the country. It's got travel, it's got really interesting characters, and I just loved it. It was such a great romp. With fabulous characters, unpredictable at times. The world building was top notch. It has some a really good mix of light-hearted moments and dark, tense moments, cool magic, and it still manages to explore some pretty deep themes such as imperialism, greed, the cost of war. And I gave this 4 stars. What I didn't like about it was the humor at times was a little bit crass. Crass toilet humor doesn't work for me. It's not my kind of humor, and I think this kind of brought it down a little bit. It is overdone at times, I think, and there is just this constant going back to these same themes. There's a big obsession with certain parts of the body, and I didn't enjoy that much. However, I would recommend this for anyone looking for a light-hearted quest fantasy that has really dark elements in it. The audiobook I read this month was Starter Villain by John Scalzi, another 2023 release. And this is a science fiction book that follows Charlie, who's a substitute teacher, until he finds out that his billionaire uncle has died and left him everything. However, once he starts delving into what is left to him, he discovers that his uncle was indeed a supervillain. And he now has inherited this lair with a supervolcano and very interesting scientific elements. This is a pretty funny book at times, even though I didn't find it as funny as I think it was intended to be. I didn't laugh out loud as much as I thought I would, although there were some really funny moments and it was genuinely witty. The premise is really cool because it's effectively a funny take on Spectre from James Bond. You could imagine, stroking cats. It actually has cats in it, which is an awesome part of the book. It's also got some really cool dolphins. The volcano lair is awesome. And I loved the ending. I really enjoyed the ending. Now, what I didn't like about this book, I ended up giving it 3 stars because it was fine. It was fun, right? But it had so much business in it. There was just this whole boring section in the middle where they're discussing business. And I get it, because I think part of the themes of this novel is really looking at the ethics of high finance and worker exploitation, which is fabulous. And when I say that, I think, wow, what an awesome novel that he's managed to bring in, cats and sci-fi and supervillains and all that, and still have some sort of social commentary on how workers are treated in large corporations. But this did not work for me. It didn't work for me. So yes. However, you know what? If you love humorous sci-fi and you just want a really fun read, highly recommend it. On my birthday, because yes, October was my birthday month, I decided to just pick up a random book just because I felt that it was going to make me feel happy. And this was the first book in the Foxcraft series. So this is Taken by Inbali Iserles. I hadn't really heard of this much, but I love foxes. Foxes are some of my favorite animals. And this is a really cute middle grade fantasy book that follows Isla, who's a young fox separated from her family. And then she has to enter the terrain of the Furless. The Furless, of course, being humans. And it follows her quest to try and find her family and find her way in the big bad world. This is a fabulous little coming of age story with awesome fox characters, great world building too from the fox perspective. So she comes across things like cars, which she calls manglers. She sees them as live creatures with burning bright eyes. The roads are seen as sort of deathways, and you just got everything is given its own name from the fox perspective. It is such a cool perspective on a city, and I think this was done incredibly well. This is a quick, entertaining read, although it is fairly predictable. I ended up giving it 4 stars, and I will definitely be continuing the series. It is a trilogy, and I'd recommend this to any lovers of foxes and anyone kind of looking for a fun yet serious read, because even though it's fun and lighthearted and it is middle grade, there are some heartbreaking and sad moments in this. Another mood read was Permutation City by Greg Egan. This was a birthday gift from my friend, and I needed to pick it up. I really needed to read a birthday gift in October, so I picked this one up, and I've been meaning to read this for quite some time. This is a science fiction novel that looks at virtual reality. So it explores the autoverse and people who are rich enough to have their consciousness scanned so that they can live in these virtual realities in cities occupying supercomputers. It was fascinating. It explores themes like what is the self, what is consciousness, mortality, equality and inequality, responsibility and consequences. And I loved these big ideas. I loved the exploration of the moral implications of technology, the question as to whether we are responsible for our past. For example, if we no longer possess a body. So if you commit a crime in your human form, that is your consciousness then responsible for it in virtual reality? I found that intriguing. There's some such intriguing questions in this book. I ended up giving it 4 stars, and I reckon I knocked off a star predominantly because of me, okay? It was my problem, not the book's problem, because I think this book is incredible, and in some ways it's a masterpiece. But it was very, very hard science. There was a lot of computer science in this, a lot of the ideas of the autoverse and dust theory, and some of it went over my head. It went over my head. I think also there were the characters were highly flawed, which I thought was pretty good, because I think that was part of the exploring that premise of inequality and consciousness and, responsibility, etc. And I loved some of the exploring how the characters interacted with their worlds, both real and virtual reality. However, one of the POVs I felt was a little bit boring. I wasn't excited when we came across chapters from his perspective, but some of the others were so engaging. I'd highly recommend this book to lovers of virtual reality, science fiction, and anyone looking for really big science ideas in a novel. And finally, I picked a fairly thematic book. And this was complete spur of the moment mood read, and it was A Night in the Lonesome October by Roger Zelazny. And yes, A Night in the Lonesome October could pretty much sum up what my October was like. But yes, let's leave that aside. This book was awesome. I loved it so much. It is sort of a horror book with fantasy elements. It's sort of genre busting on some level. And what it does is so unique. it tells a story from the perspective of a dog named Snuff, who happens to be Jack the Ripper's dog. So we're seeing everything happening through his eyes. And he is interacting with, first of all, particular characters in the novel who happen to be characters from Gothic fiction. So we come across, for example, Dracula, and we come across Sherlock Holmes and many others. And part of the enjoyment of this novel is trying to identify who these characters are from fiction. We also interact with each character's familiar. So you have cats and snakes and owls and the dog, of course, Snuff. And it's just so interesting because you'll have Snuff having these conversations with the different familiars who are then updating him on what their humans are up to next. And it turns out that they're all working towards this particular ritual at the end of the month. And they're gathering items for it, working out where it's going to take place. And then each chapter represents one night in October. It is so cool. Basically, because of the choice of POV, you're only just gradually filling in the details. And this is fascinating because you have moments where it seems lighthearted and funny, and then all of a sudden you've got some gruesome details and you realize that you're almost in the middle of this Lovecraftian-esque horror. It is just it is beautiful. It is a masterpiece. Just the integration of horror tropes with this humorous POV, and it almost makes these characters lovable. You are truly hoping that Jack the Ripper succeeds. Like, what, right? But yes, I cannot recommend this book enough. When you first start reading it, you're like, what is this? And you're not sure if you really like it. But then the second you realize what it's doing, it just grows in you. And this is a book I will not forget. It will stick with me. It is a masterpiece. I recommend it to lovers of pulp horror and anyone looking for sort of quirky Lovecraftian horror. Awesome. And that's it. That was my October. A really successful month book-wise, really, except for the 2 books on that TBR that I didn't read, but we won't mention those because I think I made up for it. And I do plan to read those 2 books. So it's not like I DNF them and they off my TBR forever. I actually really want to read them quite urgently. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And until I see you next time, take care.